Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Our presentation is called The Use of Nature-Based Solutions to Address Inequities Within Water Resources Projects. I'm Shelley Annette Biesel.
And I'm Sydney Siegerman.
And we are PhD candidates at the University of Georgia, based in Athens, Georgia. We are also presenting today on behalf of Don Nelson, Kyle McKay, and Candace Piercy. We would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement, which is a formal statement that respects Indigenous peoples and their lasting relationship with their traditional territories.
We first acknowledge that we are presenting on the traditional lands of the Muskegon Creek and Eastern Cherokee peoples, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it across generations. The legacies of the injustices suffered by Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas continue today. Living in Athens, it is equally important to honor the generation of enslaved persons whose labor built and maintained the University of Georgia, and many of whose remains have been disturbed or continue to be buried on campus. Descendants of these people continue to form an integral part of the Athens community.
First, I'll talk about what we can expect in the presentation today. First, we're going to situate this project within the anthropologies of infrastructure. Then we're going to talk about what we mean exactly when we say equity. Then we will discuss how we operationalize equity in the Army Corps of Engineers and some of our experiences working with anthropologists, engineers, and nature-based solutions. And then we'll discuss some preliminary insights and future directions for the project. In the past decade, anthropologists have become increasingly interested in the role of infrastructure in facilitating or impeding everyday life. For example, we have thought about how infrastructure is a node in a complex network of social, political, and ecological relations. We have also expanded conceptualizations of infrastructure to include technological, informational, or otherwise digital infrastructures. I'm probably not surprising anyone out there, but anthropologists have also extensively critiqued infrastructure, drawing attention to its use for biopolitical control, and we have acutely critiqued infrastructural projects for their empty promises that often are premised on capitalist, developmentalist mythologies of progress. And some anthropologists have thoroughly researched how infrastructure or lack thereof can create or exacerbate existing social inequalities. Despite all of this important work, there have been aspects of anthropologies of infrastructure that have not been adequately explored. The first is the relationship between infrastructure and equity. While all of the aforementioned approaches are arguably implicitly about equity, the relationship between infrastructure and equity has yet to be adequately theorized. In other words, while anthropologists, myself included, love to gesture at the concept of equity by highlighting things that are inequitable, we have largely failed to consider how equity might be operationalized in infrastructure projects. The second gap in anthropologies of infrastructure concerns natural or nature-based infrastructure. While, for example, anthropologists have looked at how so-called sustainable urban development initiatives have contributed to environmental gentrification, we have yet to understand the social or political implications of nature-based or natural infrastructure. That is, infrastructure that mimics natural processes, providing ecosystem services that can reduce environmental risks, such as flooding. While many of us understand that natural infrastructure is needed to heal our rapidly changing environment, we do not yet know the social or political implications of natural or nature-based infrastructure. In other words, can natural infrastructure be used to advance rather than impede equity? Like many other social scientists, we at the Human and Environmental Change Labs at the University of Georgia have been concerned by the racial injustices of recent years and have grappled with how we can use our specific areas of expertise to advance equity goals. As a result, we have partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers as part of a larger network for engineering with nature, or NOON. The group comes together every other week to discuss how nature-based infrastructure, rather than creating a kind of environmental gentrification, might be operationalized to enhance equity.
Okay, now let's dive into what we mean by equity. The concept of equity is often conflated with equality. However, whereas equality is based off of sameness, equity is premised on the recognition of difference. Equity involves the acknowledgement of historically unequal power relations that engender present social disparities, and also of a plurality of perspectives in society. We can understand equity as formal action towards social justice, where social justice is defined as parity of participation in social life. On the flip side, inequity is systemic wrongdoing based on arbitrary traits like race, gender, or class. I really like the example of the bicycles to understand the difference between equality and equity. On the top, we see 4 individuals with what in today's world would be a conventional bicycle. That's 2 wheels of the same size, handlebars, and a seat. However, we have 4 unique individuals, one of whom is in a wheelchair, another who is very tall, someone else who is the correct stature for the standardized bike, and a child who can barely reach the pedals. Now, whereas equality entails all 4 individuals having access to the same bicycle in this instance, there is a disparity in participation in social life or being able to ride a bike. Now, when we think about equity, we see that the 4 individuals have bicycles that fit their needs so they can participate in bike riding. The person in the wheelchair has a recumbent bike with hand pedals, the taller individual has a larger bike, and the little boy has a smaller bike with training wheels. Now, one of the reasons I like this example is because we often think of a bicycle as something that has always been what it is now, this standardized bike. However, bicycles themselves were not always made this way, and bikes don't have to be made this way. As we can see in the example of the equity section, there are different ways that a bicycle can be constructed, such that individuals can use the bike for leisure, for transportation, what have you. In addition to distinguishing between equality and equity, when we refer to equity, we need to ask 2 main questions. First, equity of what? And equity between whom? When the concept of equity, though, is put into practice, it is most often associated with the unjust or just distribution of risks, benefits, and harms between particular groups and individuals. Distributional aspects of equity are important, but the exclusive attention to issues of distribution hinders the ability to understand and address underlying causes of these observed material disparities. For that reason, our framework aligns with work by Schulzberg, Leach, and others, and begins with the premise that equity can be understood as interconnected dimensions of distributional, procedural, and recognitional equity. We depict equity as a tree in order to point out the analytical differences between the 3 dimensions, while also highlighting their fundamental interconnectedness and dynamic feedbacks. Distributional equity refers to the fair allocation of both material and non-material benefits and harms, as well as risks, opportunities, and resources. Differences in the distribution of these elements are inequitable when the differences are the result of morally arbitrary factors related to one's identity. A disproportionately greater share of risks and harms negatively impacts well-being. What constitutes an opportunity, benefit, harm, or risk is often based off of external standards. Yet this negates the diversity and differences in sociocultural values among and within particular communities, which ties back to how distributional equity is fundamentally related to recognition. Procedural equity is the fair participation in decision-making processes. It involves the ability of different people to influence decisions and the extent to which people's values, perspectives, and knowledge are incorporated into decisions. At the same time, in order to have procedural equity, it is necessary to acknowledge and respect these differences. That is, again, have recognition. Recognitional equity is the acknowledgement of human social difference and the respect of this difference by social institutions. Social differences are expressed in myriad ways, including as language, land and water use practices, and spiritual beliefs. Recognitional inequity occurs through the failure by social institutions to acknowledge or respect these differences. This failure is integral to the subordination of members of a particular group and stems from status within hierarchies of cultural value, which form part of intersecting relations of oppression and privilege. Aspects of the physical environment in the diagram, represented mostly by ecosystem integrity, built infrastructure, and land uses, are interconnected to institutions, which we depict as laws and regulations and de facto rules, and sociocultural systems. which involve economic values, intersectional identities, and sociocultural values. These facets recursively shape inequities within the system under analysis. A major challenge in water resource infrastructure projects within the Corps and other agencies is addressing present inequities as they relate to injustice in the past and in consideration of the possible trajectories of equity into the future. Now, how can we go from the concept of equity to putting that concept into practice? Well, we're going to look at equity in the context of a particular infrastructure agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps is a large federal agency with three main water management missions related to navigation, flood risk management, and ecosystem restoration. Within the Corps, equity as social outcomes has long been considered. However, it hasn't really been given primacy. Historically, economic outcomes have been given priority over social outcomes. This mindset changed in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina made visible huge inequities within how water infrastructure and how policies impact different groups of people, with Black communities being disproportionately negatively affected by these structures. With that, Hurricane Katrina is considered a focusing event that became an impetus for greater attention to equity in project planning in the Corps. And since then, there have been federal orders and initiatives like Engineering with Nature to address issues of equity and to find new paths to effectively consider equity, including the use of nature-based infrastructure. Now, whereas equity has really come into the forefront of conversations in many groups in the Corps, there are important obstacles to incorporating equity. One group of obstacles comes from the training that engineers get. Overall, there's minimal understanding of the concept of equity because engineers aren't trained to deal with it. So there's a perceived lack of qualitative and quantitative metrics. However, when someone dives into metrics to use, turns out that there are a ton of social metrics that could measure facets of equity. And this in turn can lead to paralysis of choice because there are just too many metrics to choose from. Another group of obstacles comes from the fact that there are unclear connections between how these possible metrics can be related to standard project planning frameworks in the present. And there are not many examples of how equity can and is being applied. There's also a discomfort with non-monetary metrics. Since the Corps receives and uses funding from federal tax money, there's a key connection between communicating effectiveness into dollar amounts. Yet for a lot of social metrics, putting a dollar sign on them isn't intuitive, nor probably the best thing to do. So there's also a lack of decision rules for how to compare and contrast monetary and non-monetary metrics, particularly when thinking about different alternatives for a project. Finally, there exists different epistemologies or knowledges and understandings of how to address fundamental questions of equity. The Network for Engineering with Nature, or NUN, is a community of researchers, practitioners, and educators that was established in summer 2002 in order to address major infrastructure challenges, including the incorporation of equity in planning processes. Nature-based solutions are being explored by this network and open opportunities to approach challenges, including equity, in new ways when compared to traditional gray infrastructure. However, equity itself cannot be guaranteed in these processes without a critical eye of what equity is, how equity is defined, and what dimensions of equity are being paid attention to. So that's where the equity team comes in, that Shelley and I are a part of. And we've been working with the rest of the group since August to develop practical ways to incorporate equity in water infrastructure project planning in order to address the legacies of past injustices, address current inequities, and to create greater equity into the future.
While this is still an ongoing collaboration, we have some preliminary insights to offer. The first is that it is a lot easier to talk about inequalities than to try to operationalize equity, especially in the context of nature based infrastructure. We found that despite having an open minded team with Noon, concepts and ideas were difficult to translate from anthropologists to engineers to actionable steps for change. Certainly, some of the limitations are the institutional protocols that the core must follow, including the pressure to optimize or justify spending tax dollars and or the unfamiliarity with existing equity metrics. But we also found within those restrictions ample opportunities for change. The core seemed to recognize some of its historic failures and is open minded about doing things differently. Given the interrelated social and ecological challenges ahead, we believe that natural infrastructure can and should be prioritized to contend with rapid environmental change. The question remains if this can be done in such a way that strengthens justice and promotes well being rather than causing further dispossession and inequality. It is precisely because of the discipline's critical engagement with infrastructure that we believe anthropologists are particularly qualified and should be sitting at the table to help planners and public servants think about how infrastructure might promote rather than diminish social equity goals. So please get to work.
Thank you so much for joining. We look forward to your questions and comments in the chat.